Ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to give 1 or 2 minutes just to allow the audience to come in, but we will be starting on time. For those who don't know us, my name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director for My Security Media, and welcome to our My Security TV. And today we're going to hear from ALSID and Trustwave on Active Directory security. I'm joined by Kevin Tran, Director for Asia Pacific and Japan at Spiderlabs, Trustwave, and Ben Mudie, Pre-Sales Manager with ALSID. Gents, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us, Chris.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
So obviously with Active Directory, we're going to talk through the AD landscape, or threat landscape. Have a also look at the relationship with ransomware, the common vulnerabilities in Active Directory that have been exploited, and best practices to avoid compromise. Now, I just did a little bit of background. So 90% of the world's enterprise organizations use Active Directory as their primary method for authentication and authorization. And according to Microsoft, about 95 million AD accounts are the target of cyber attacks every single day. So the protocols for this particular session, we do welcome audience input. We welcome your questions. We will run some polls as we go through. And I'm just waiting for a few more of the audience to sort of come through, but I do have a poll ready that we might start with, and the session is being recorded. And there's also a number of handouts available to you. There's ALSID Academy EP 1 and 2 available for download if you just go to your menu there. And then there's ALSID for Active Directory Detect and Prevent white papers, and then there's the ALSID brochure. So please take the time to download that content. And let's start off just with what will get a little bit of participation and allow 1 or 2 minutes for people to come in. But for those that are in, I'm just going to run this first poll, and then I'll hand over to Ben to sort of kick off the session. But let's run a poll on what's the best tool your organisation is using to secure Active Directory today. Just take the time to walk through that. I should be able to, there's 5 options. Okay, so no one's using C or D, the point of time auditing and the PowerShell scripts and vulnerability management tools. Those options were spread out, but gives you an idea of where we're at today. Ben, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Perfect. So I'll give you a brief introduction into the session, as well as a little bit of an overview of what ALSID does, and then Kevin can give an introduction into what Trustwave does. But as a collaboration, you know, Trustwave and ALSID, we have very complementary efforts in creating a security posture for your organization that can actually protect the crown jewels, which is the authentication service, which as Chris introduced there, is in 95% of organizations Active Directory. So I am Ben Mudie. I am the technical pre-sales manager for ALSID here in Australia. And I'll hand over to Kevin for him to give an introduction into himself.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm Kevin Tran. I'm the director of the Spiderlabs penetration testing and red teaming practice across the Asia Pacific region for Trustwave. So as a background myself, I used to be a penetration tester, and I've led quite a lot of red teams across the region. And as we see in most cases, Active Directory becomes a key part of the compromise step. And also, as you've read in real world attacks as well, it's often the facilitation because of how it's interconnected into everything. So we're here to provide some insights based on what we see and how we've worked with ALSID to help our customers.
And my background is as a Windows systems and network administrator. So I've actually been there dealing with the security side of Active Directory and trying to run and manage environments where you've got a large number of users on a very disparate fleet. And you know, Active Directory holds that all together for most organizations. So a brief agenda. And we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them, because something that works very well with this is don't be afraid to ask the question, because asking the question is quite often the first way that you can actually move towards understanding what the risk is in your Active Directory. And Kevin and I have, numerous customer engagements, and we've seen environments of all sorts of sizes and security issues of all sorts of types as well. You would be very surprised to learn that, Active Directory is used from organizations that have 1 or 2 people that might have a server running, Windows small business services sitting under a desk, and you've got the large enterprise customers of the world with hundreds of thousands of users, and the same security risks are across the board, because it is a common ecosystem that they're working on. So the first thing I'll do is I'll give an introduction into who ALSID is and what we do as an organization. So ALSID as an organization, we are here to try and modernize efforts in Active Directory security. A lot of the previous types of security you're dealing with Active Directory have been, very point-in-time based. We were founded by incident responders, so people who actually went in to try and work out how an attack progressed through an organization, and also how they could secure that. And out of that, they wrote a white paper and an associated utility to be able to use graph theory to understand Active Directory. That was turned into a tool by another group called Bloodhound, which is a very common tool now used by red teamers and attackers alike to map and understand organizations' networks when it comes to the Active Directory, just because they are so complex and the organization has, a large footprint. Using graph theory or a tool like that allows you to understand and find lateral movement targets in the environment. And, in general, it's we're modernizing the effort by doing all of this in real time, so you can actually respond to security issues immediately and not let them just sit there. We also now have offices in multiple countries, and we have over 100 customers, over 4 million AD users now protected. I'll hand over to you, Kevin, for Trustwave.
Great, thanks, Ben. So just a little bit about Trustwave, and then we can kick this show off. So in terms of who we are and what we do, if I can keep the screen on.
You want me to?
Sorry.
Yep.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So a little bit about who we are. We have our security services across different spectrums. So if you're familiar with our company, you might have heard our name being mentioned quite a lot in the monitoring and in the MSS space. We've had quite a lot of recognition there with our prowess in doing threat intelligence and threat intelligence-based monitoring and managed security services across the world. We also have a background in developing security technologies. So we do a lot of database security products. And also some application scanners, and now more into the cloud security space. We've also got a email gateway solution. But more into the space that I work in the Spiderlabs space and the rest of the consulting and professional services arm. We do a lot of work around attack and response. So my team in particular looks at the attack simulation, penetration testing, and vulnerability management side of things there. We're complemented by the Spiderlabs digital forensics and incident response group. And we're supported by our threat intelligence part, which help our threat hunters and incident responders know about what's actually happening out in real world. They feed that intelligence back into us, and we replicate those attacks as part of our red teaming activities for our customers. We work quite closely with our consulting branch that deals a lot with the security governance, architecture and design, best practices type review work. So if you're looking into work in the NIST SP800s or ISO 27000s, and if you're in Australia and you're looking into things like CPS 234, for example, we've got people that work in that space and help you do those compliance programs. We also have a group that's based purely on education, where we've got a facility that helps us run various we would call cyber range and tabletop type exercises for or anywhere from the executive audiences all the way down to your low-level responders that need a bit of technical training in a safe environment. We've run with our education facility people different types of attack simulation programs, or we replicate the tool sets they've got, then we run through like a step-by-step type of attack. So it's basically like a purple teaming class, if you want to call it that. So we operate across different spectrums of security services, so we're able to help with different types of security problems. And Spiderlabs can be considered a core part of that, because we see a lot of issues with our red teaming and pen testing that feed into finding root cause issues, like the ones around Active Directory and how it's managed in organizations, to sort of best practices around how people aren't managing passwords or privileged accounts properly, which lend towards more of the security risk management space as well. So we're a pretty diverse and big group. We operate across pretty much every single continent with about 2,000 employees around the world. So we've been around for also about 25 years now. So we're not a new kid on the block if you haven't heard of us before. Our roots are historically from the US, where we were originally a PCI-based company and now have spread across the world, and in particular in Asia Pacific, where we've seen a lot of growth over the last 2 years.
Thank you very much,
great.
Kevin. So we're going to give an introduction now into, Active Directory and why it's a bit of a challenge. Kevin's going to be talking you through a lot of, the background and why it's a challenge to secure and why it's a challenge to progress with.
So on this first topic, I think it's pretty obvious to say that Active Directory is a core part of any organization. I think Chris has given us the stats to kind of back up that point, that globally, virtually every single company has it in any sort of form. Obviously, one of the reasons why it's so critical to a lot of organizations is that it's interconnected to everything. It's basically the gatekeeper that manages your user identities and has all the access control to your different bits of corporate data across your systems, your file shares, or anything that you've got connected through single sign-on, for example. These days, there's a very strong possibility that there's an authentication or that kind of process flow through Active Directory. Integrated, obviously, into services like your Exchange and therefore your email. And these days, we're also seeing, especially with the prevalence of in our SCADA environment, everything's becoming more IP-based. There's more interconnectivity with standard Windows networking, and also with Active Directory as its central repository for managing accounts and access. And with the changing technology, we're going towards more cloud. So we're seeing things like Azure FS, ADFS, and such being used. So there's a lot more interconnectivity into cloud-based services with Office 365 and all those as well. So the issue with this is it's basically got its it's got its fingers in every pie. It's connected everywhere. So there's a lot of different interconnected risks that come with that. To give you an idea about what we see in the attack simulation space, a lot of our customers are asking us to focus a lot more on cloud-based attacks, business email compromise, and those type of activities, because they realize now that because of their move towards O365 and those type of services, you're expanding that kind of Active Directory and their credential footprint into the cloud. So if you can break into someone's account in the cloud, you have a very good chance you can get into their email and therefore pivot from that type of service into their internal network. So so we're seeing that kind of shift in that space as well. And this is why Active Directory at its core is becoming even more important. On to the next slide. So one of the things that people have to realize is Active Directory itself as a core technology hasn't changed much. So if we look into its past, the initial releases going back as far as 1993, and the most modern version that we've seen in terms of architecture back in 1999. From when we do pen testing and red teaming, we still see some really, really early versions of Active Directory still in use. So for myself personally, one of the last red teams I did a couple of years ago, I still saw an organization using NT4. So you can imagine how out of date that is, and we're looking at this is around 2016, 2017, where a domain controller like that is still being used, and you can see that it's terribly out of date. But unfortunately, it's still the case in what we see. We still also find instances of Active Directory running on Windows 2003 and 2008, which they themselves are out-of-date operating systems and such now, because of all the kind of legacy environments that need to be supported with legacy applications and such like that. So it's been around the block quite a long time, And the issues that we want to flag with it is that it was built around the times where networks a lot more simplified. Everything was a bit more trusted and connected in one spot. You didn't really have the whole expansive cross-domain trust that we see these days across parent and child organizations and subsidiaries and partnerships and all that sort of stuff going on. The internet obviously wasn't as widespread and as backboned as it is these days. When we talk about early 90s, it was quite expensive, and it operated under the assumption of trust. So security wasn't really a key part of it. It was more about interconnectivity and accessibility to information and data. So a lot of those kind of issues that we see today stem from that kind of foundation that was acceptable for that time. So when we look at it in hindsight, some of the things that were okay back then are the problems that we exploit now. So we think about things like authentication protocols, and one topic which we'll cover on a bit later is around the KERBEROASTABLE protocol and how we exploit it. For example, that was built with that whole interconnectivity and different protocol support back then. All the concepts of privilege and control and access management and delegated rights to perform certain administrative tasks that you would give to an IT admin, for example. For example, changing someone's password. That kind of behavior was basically standard and acceptable in the previous model, but these days they're the things that we typically exploit in real life attacks. And we'll cover a couple of these demos at a later part of this presentation to show you why these things are a problem. And the last point is, back then, this was, again, all about interconnectivity. You wanted people to be able to see anything and everything, because you wanted everyone to be able to collaborate. And those issues back then, those kind of concepts back then create the issues that we have now, because that was the key point. You wanted everyone to be able to work together. So if we move on to a couple of kind of high-level examples, these are some of the visualizations of what of the reasons as to why we think that securing Active Directory is particularly hard. So in the first example, we have a typical situation, and it's something along the lines of a finance department between the parent and child, or a subsidiary, or some sort of interlinked organization that's come across together through mergers and acquisitions, having some sort of shared domain trust because of the need for a shared finance application, for example. Breaking and changing that type of authentication would probably be a lot harder than and a lot more time consuming and costly for a lot of organizations when they're trying to do reconciliations and that sort of thing. So we find that this is that kind of symbolic example as to why changing and fixing a lot of the existing architectures is hard, because this kind of access issue or access architecture propagates. And it might not necessarily be around a finance application. It could be a shared knowledge repository, some sort of internal wiki back then that people needed access to. There could be some sort of printing service you need to share between different companies. All these kind of interconnectivity between parent and child organizations are the core part of what happens. And an example too, you might see slightly more complex versions of this with like MSSs and any sort of IT security provider, or even with your managed services of any sort of IT management. It's the issue of having some sort of centralized IT group that has some sort of cross-domain administration privilege, where they can authenticate into any part of your child domain in your network for resetting passwords, applying updates, changing configurations and such like that there. That lends to a lot of issues around spreading of access and having what we call their passwords cached across different servers across all these organizations that they have access to, and that ends up being the points in which they can be attacked. And we'll talk about credential dumping in relation to example 2 further on the presentation. But these are some kind of high-level examples as to why these issues still propagate to this day, because they're often hard to fix for reasons of like not affording any downtime, or it's just too critical an application, as we keep hearing. And I'll hand over to Ben to talk about some of these other examples as well.
Now, the biggest problem is that Active Directory has been so successful in terms of, proliferating itself, in terms of becoming so connected inside enterprises, and they have, really adopted it, because you've got, not only your typical systems like your email and your calendaring and file sharing and things like that. You've also got the control of the workstations themselves. So there's technologies built into Active Directory like group policy, which is how organizations are quite often restricting what people can actually do with the computer at the end, trying to, set corporate wallpapers or make sure that when you log on for the first time, your email is correctly configured and, you can't go in and install software. And because of this, and because of that command and control nature that Active Directory has, it's a really, hot source target for attackers, because if you can go after a singular system that will let you take over a very large percentage of the enterprise, that's what you're going to go after. And because of the reasonably trusted nature that comes with Active Directory, being the Active Directory having a setup where it was designed so that you could go and look, who is in my organization. I want to know every user, or I want to know, in particular, some details. I might have their phone number associated with their Active Directory account. I might need to know who their manager is, things like this. All of these things that are built into Active Directory are a really good source for an attacker, because they know what to go after next. They can see who has privilege over particular objects and allow them to, laterally move through an environment and get after their target. And their target quite often is the crown jewels, because if you can modify the Active Directory with that command and control nature, in particular, things like malware, you can drop it in one place and you can have it go out to all of the workstations in the environment, and you can do something like the crypto locker malwares, or even, the data exfiltration type malware. You can have multiple endpoints that you're controlling. Now, Active Directory as well, because of its nature, has a lot of areas where an attacker can try and hide. We have seen, some of the reports that organizations have done when they've had their breaches, like the ones that we're having a look at here on the slide. These are very large-scale breaches. Some of them, are much more well-known than others. Baltimore is very well-known, as is Norsk Hydro. In some of these, the attackers were in the environment for an awfully long time, waiting for something that was the catalyst for them to be able to move further into the environment. So how do we go about identifying the risks in our Active Directory? Well, there's a lot of them. Now, do you want to talk through a couple of them, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, with what we were saying about the historical stuff about how Active Directory is used, one of the issues is just having too many administrators or just losing track of how things are configured. Things evolve over time. You've got organizations that inherit other organizations through mergers and whatnot. You just keep adding more admins to them, and then unless you're doing and being proactive auditing, these type of issues keep progressing. So you might have 30 or 40 people or more inside your domain admins group when you don't even know the reasons why, or you might just plug it in there because it's easy to do so. And a lot of companies end up doing that. And there's a lot of settings and such they might have put in there, and they just, you just end up losing track. So there's all that kind of background issue as to why these issues become a bit more of a problem as time progresses, because you forget and you just, you have no idea, and you're just too afraid to remove anything as a result.
Yeah, definitely. We see that quite a lot, where organizations will have configurations in their Active Directory that they won't touch for fear of something going wrong, or for fear of, in particular, deleting user accounts or even disabling those user accounts. We've seen organizations where their process is not to disable an administrator account or do anything with it except for change its password and store it somewhere. They're not disabling these accounts for fear of, if they disable that account, will it stop something working? And these sort of things are where a lot of the source issues come from.
Ben, if I can interrupt, we've got a poll question on that, on maybe just test the audience. Let me just run this poll on how many known misconfigurations there are. Let me just run that.
Yeah, no worries.
And what do you reckon, Ben? What was the answer?
There's a lot of them.
Yeah. So it'd be 300 plus, yeah?
Yes. Now, it's because there's so many different ways that Active Directory can be attacked, because you have both issues with protocol, you've got issues with configuration, you've also got issues with privilege, which is a little bit of protocol and privilege and configuration, because they all tie together, because an account can be relatively secure, but one tick box can make that account wide open to compromise. So in this example we've got up on the screen right now, we have a brief explanation to just find how old are credentials in your environment. How many accounts can you list that have passwords older than 1 year? So this is a really simple thing that you can run, that you can run on nearly any computer that's got the AD tools installed on it, and they're a reasonably easy thing to install if you're a systems administrator, or even if you have some form of security role where you would need these utilities to be able to go in and look at the Active Directory. And you'll be very surprised to find out, run this, export it out to a text file, and sometimes the results will shock you, because you will sometimes see accounts in your environment that may not have had their credentials rolled over for 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure about you, but I don't trust my 5-year-old passwords. I know how bad they were back then, because systems didn't require you to have them as secure. So we would often pick something common with, we might throw in some numbers there, but we don't have to have the entropy that we do now. There's some really good strategies for passwords nowadays, but Active Directory is designed to be one password for many things, but it comes with a risk, because if you let it sit there for too long, the ability for computers, particularly people who are trying to brute force it or crack our passwords, it just gets so much easier, because computational power gets better every year, which means it's going to take less time for somebody to crack your password if they use one of the weaknesses, which we might talk through later on, to be able to get the hash or the an encoded version of your password out. So I'll hand this one over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, so we've got a demo for this one, but just to kind of talk about this quickly with respect to the kind of legacy protocols, like one of the issues we've had with, or one of the issues we've been able to demonstrate quite a lot is because of how KERBEROAST works and the whole ticketing relationship you get, like what happens in practice is that a lot of service accounts are set up with a service principal name. So something like your Microsoft SQL Server, for example, can authenticate over KERBEROAST. So the attack technique in that respect is you can actually go and request through KERBEROAST their ticket, which ends up being their password that's encrypted with a really, really weak hashing algorithm, for example. So what happens with this is that if you've got a weak password for that service account, it's actually quite a trivial activity to go and crack. One of the reasons this becomes quite, I guess, prevalent in use is that once an attacker has any sort of authenticated privilege on the network, they can use this attack. They can then go to request from AD, give me the ticket of this account, then you get the hash. They take that hash, they go and crack it pretty quickly. If it's like an 8-character password that's been sitting around there for 5 years, for example, as Ben's pointed out there, it's a pretty trivial effort. And we might find something like company name 123 as one of the common ones that we see quite often, or the summer of 2015 or something. And we can infer that type of information by looking at the password last change date and a couple of other things that you can chain together to get a sense of what you think people's passwords would be. And we have this knowledge because we see it often, and we replicate it across a lot of different organizations. So with this particular attack then, once you get the password, we can crack, once we get the password hash, we crack it, and we can basically get a service account level privilege on the network. And quite often, because of the interrelated issue around domain admin accounts or service accounts being added to a very, very privileged group that doesn't get changed, it might be a very, very quick and easy way to get domain admin or enterprise admin or any sort of admin privileges by running this kind of KERBEROASTing attack. The issue with it is that you can't actually fix it. So the only way to kind of mitigate the risk is to set a 25-character minimum password, resetting it twice and such like that, and then making sure that you reset this password and change it, like, you know, every 18 months or whatever is like reasonable in the sense of managing a password for a server's account. So, you know, these are some of the historical issues that still exist in Active Directory to this day, and we still can basically use this at this moment with all sorts of tool sets available that are constantly up to date. So there's a very, very simple PowerShell script you can get, and a couple of tools like RubyS or something you can use as a red teamer and throw it on a company network, get a Kerberos ticket, crack it, and then, you know, away you go.
Speaking about that, there's also, you know, from an attacker who just gets access to a workstation, for instance, just using built-in Windows commands, you can actually, you know, infer some of these accounts. Now, you know, we're not all going to be allowed to run RubyS or even Mimikatz or any of these sort of attacker tools on our corporate workstations. Sometimes information security might get a little unhappy if you try and go and run some of these tools on your company computers. But something that is completely non-invasive that you can actually go and do is you can run this PowerShell command that I've listed out here. Now, this will show you all of them in the environment, so it doesn't necessarily mean these accounts are privileged or not, but quite often you can infer from their name and sometimes their group memberships whether or not these are accounts that an attacker would go after. And as you saw, you know, with the previous command that we showed, it's actually trivial easy to try and find out, you know, can you line up the two lists? Do you have an account that has a password that hasn't been set in 5 years? And do you have an account that is privileged with a KERBEROASTABLE service principal name attached to it? So even without having the ability to run some of these attacker tools, you can actually find out a lot of information about, you know, what's in your environment with the built-in tools that you have access to. And quite often it can actually be a really good process to try and investigate and learn about exactly what an unprivileged user can get out of your Active Directory, because it will give you perspective on how easy it is for an attacker to try and walk through the front door and then, you know, try and find another door that they can go through. So the typical thing of just evading the barrier because they see somebody's already walked through it. So these are some of the things that you can, you know, you can start doing. And we'll get on to explaining a lot more of these later on in terms of, you know, what are some of the brief things that you can do with some commands to, you know, find out a little bit about your environment and just try and learn. So I'm going to give a basic demo right now, and this basic demonstration is using an attacker tool. And what I'm doing here is I'm taking advantage of a weakness within group policy that allows passwords to be stored in memory. Now, why is this important? Because what I'm doing here is I can do this offline. I don't have to do this on the computer I'm going to get the password out of, but what I'm doing right now is I'm using a built-in Windows command to dump the memory of a service called ALSID. And what that service does is it stores, you know, credential ticket information as well as a lot of other things. But what I'm doing here is I'm using built-in commands. There is literally nothing special about the command I'm doing here to create a memory dump. And then from that memory dump, I can then use that now to try and either crack that password or taking advantage of a weakness I'm looking for, where I'm going to now open a new window and I'm going to go to my attacker tool. What I could have done, oh, hold on, that just repeated. Give me a sec. That's the right one. What I could do is I could take that file onto another computer that's, you know, not protected. And what I can do is I can analyze that dump file, and I can go looking, and I want to go and I want to try and find the credential for any user that might be stored in clear text, or I could be going and looking for some of those hash credentials as well if I need to. So we can see here we've gone and analyzed that, and because of a vulnerability in wdigest, it's stored the credential for this user in clear text, and we can see it's listed here. And this is a setting that is enabled through the registry and group policy. So this is a brief example of something that an attacker would try and do on an environment where they would go looking for, you know, the thing that gives them access to what they need. In this instance, they might want a lateral movement target because they need, you know, more group access. It's not necessarily about always compromising your Active Directory. Data exfiltration and theft is also something they're really heavily going after. So all of these weaknesses can have compromise, not only from a, you know, malware and attack perspective, but it can also just be plain out data theft. You might be going and looking for the latest device your company is launching shortly, and want to trade stock based on, you know, what you find. So these are things and weaknesses that are good to be identified. So cool. Now that comes down to how do we actually explain the risk. So I'll get Kevin to talk you through a typical attack scenario on an organization's Active Directory environment, and then I'll talk about, you know, the concepts that you can use to quantify, you know, what would this actually mean to our environment, and why you should, you know, be pushing to have, you know, some form of budget put around your program to secure your Active Directory, be that, you know, red teaming exercises, a tool like ALSID, or even, you know, some time to just assess your network to quantify that.
Cool. So what we've got is a typical example based around, I believe we have is, oops, yep, go ahead. Oh, sorry, is the sequence out of date?
No, it should be okay. Yep, there it goes, it's moving.
Okay, great. So think about the typical example of like a spear phishing attack against an employee. You know, you get a payload, you end up opening it on your machine, and you're a normal user, right? So what will typically happen is you infect that first person, and then that ransomware will then basically start spreading across the network. So, you know, if you think about like this in the user domain, think about an example like you know, NotPetya from a couple of years ago and how virulent it was. It would infect the first victim, it will spread across different victims across the network using those different privilege escalation techniques like Ben showed you of doing memory dumping and capturing any sort of username and password in memory. There'll be, you know, potentially some sort of exploit around it as well. And there's also different protocols like, you know, I mentioned KERBEROAST earlier and such that you could use to authenticate across the entire network. So what you'll end up having is starting from the user land, you know, they'll spread their access up from the users to the servers and workstations. And this is all because everything is tied into Active Directory. More often than not, you'll have an administrator over a server log into a end user workstation for administrative purposes. Your malware will infect that workstation containing that server administrative privileges and then spread into the server and applications domain, where they'll then infect other targets and then repeat the same attack of, you know, dumping memory, running exploits, doing KERBEROASTing, whatever it needs to do in order to get additional credentials. And then sooner or later, that's basically a repeat process where they'll eventually get access to some sort of domain admin credential or a privileged administrator account that has the rights to log on to the domain controller because of how it's typically used to administer your server and any sort of application server database and such in this zone. So that's how these attacks typically spread. You come in through the user area, you spread across, you find the credential of someone more privileged, jump up a level into the data tier in this case here, repeat the same process, and eventually you'll find the credentials that let you go into the domain controllers. And at that point, you've basically got full keys to the kingdom. You've got full control over every single action and aspect that is connected to your domain.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, one of the things that an attacker will do is they'll, you know, they might bounce through multiple end computers to get to their goal because they are going and they're looking, they're prospecting, they're hunting. So the path to being a domain administrator is not always direct. And what that also comes out to is, you know, the quantifying of the cost of these sort of attacks is primarily down to both the reputation of the organization, especially if you're in a particular industry like banking or something like that. If your Active Directory is targeted and attacked and they're successful in, you know, exfiltrating data, people are going to be less likely, A, to want to go with you. B, if you look in the terms of the Equifax hack, do you want to trust your, you know, your financial history being with Equifax when that is now, you know, Equifax had storage of people's, you know, social security numbers and, you know, a lot of identifying information, including dates of birth. Now, you know, some of the systems that Active Directory are connected to and control will quite often have, you know, PII information that means that those systems need to be classified. Now, the classification of those is normally of a protected level, but we're not normally applying that same security approach to our Active Directory because we're forgetting that it's the command and control of those systems. People are seeing it as a business layer, not necessarily as the layer of that control aspect where they have it. Now, out of these, you look at what the organizations have lost, either in their share value, their customers, or even in a raw financial impact, whether or not they've had to pay a ransom, or B, they've had to pay to completely rebuild their Active Directory and their environment. And one of the good ones here has been Norsk Hydro, because they've been, you know, very open about, you know, the attack that happened, how they've gone about investigating and remediating. And they're also a case for our next bit, which is we have cyber insurance. We should be protected. Don't worry about the financial impacts of this. But if we go and have a look at the most recent information that we've been able to grab from you know, media articles, they had a net impact of $70 to $80 million to their bottom line in terms of, you know, what has this attack cost us from a financial perspective. And their insurance has only paid out a quarter of that so far. So if you look at the perspective of not only the raw monetary value, and these guys, the insurance hasn't covered them for everything. There's the impact from a perspective of, you know, brand and reputation, as well as, you know, future performance. Because if your organization is tarred with, you know, we've had an Active Directory compromise, is that going to affect a customer A or customer B joining you, especially if they're, you know, slightly technical in nature, or have had one of the horrible emails that say, we were hacked, this is the information they got, this is how you should try and protect yourself. I know, I've gotten more than one of those. So these are the sort of things organizations need to look at avoiding. Now, there's a lot of basic steps we can take to do the remediation. So I was talking earlier about, you know, red teaming from people like Kevin and the good folks over at Spiderlabs, as well as, you know, using tool sets like ours where we're doing the investigation and interrogation of Active Directory in a real-time and constant nature to close the gap of response. The biggest thing, we've got to stop ignoring the risks. The risks about our Active Directory and, you know, just knowing what can potentially be out there. Don't try and, you know, put the world saying, you know, ours is perfect. There's absolutely no problems. I can tell you I've done a very large number of assessments here in Australia where an organization is like, yep, we've got privilege control, we've got all of these things. We'll go in, we'll do our assessment, and they're like, oh, we didn't know about that one. We didn't know that, you know, the oldest credential in our environment was a couple of years old. Or the big one is we didn't know that a particular secret that everything is based on in, the environment called the Kerberos ticket granting ticket account password, it hasn't been changed since 2011. So these are the sort of things that you don't know what you don't know, and sometimes the fear is, not lifting up the curtain to find out what's underneath. It's just, it's fine, it's sitting in the corner. So we need to stop ignoring the risks that are in there. And you can do some very basic things that, basically cost nothing to be able to, start investigating some of these risks. And the analogy that one of our sales guys here has is the prevention is always better than the cure. We don't want to have just attack detection where, you've crashed into the wall and you get an SMS saying you've crashed. You want to be told as soon as you hop in your car, or, even while it's sitting in the driveway, that says, you've got an issue, you need to start looking at this, and we need to start, preemptively going and looking at some of these issues, because we can do basic investigations about our environment. And one of the most trivial ones that we can actually do is just start by finding how many administrators you have in your environment. It's a easy command to run. You can basically nearly run it from any workstation in the environment. There is, some tricks that you can actually use to lock people out from being the administrator, being able to see who are administrators. But I have not seen those in a large number of organizations. I've only seen them in a small handful. But if you are in a privileged account or have a privileged account, you can just run this command to find out not only who are the current administrators, but the inferred administrators. So this command will actually cross a couple of different groups, because you've got different types of administrators. You've got your, your enterprise administrators and things like that. So there's a lot of different types of administrators, and a tool like ours will help you quantify and understand the risks about those. But a basic one, just find out how many administrators you have, and quite often it will shock you how many administrators you've got in there. I did a recent call with somebody where we ran this command as part of an AD health check, and they're like, oh, there's 40. I didn't know there would be 40. And like a good, 20% of them were like, oh, we don't use that tool anymore. We don't use that tool anymore, but they're still in there and they're still an administrator. They're still in the enabled state. So they haven't been correctly decommissioned. So, lifting up that curtain and finding out the information is the best thing. Do you have anything you want to say on that one first, Kevin, before I proceed?
It's a good point. Like, as an attacker, we would run commands like this to enumerate the domain. So when we're attacking an organization, we want to find out how we can spread our access and, how we can dig into, more privileges so we can actually find the information we want. And, one of that is finding out, who the admins are, where the service accounts are, which account can we target without raising an alert, because they're probably monitoring for an admin account. So stuff like this is what we would typically run in order to find out, what type of inferred or what accounts that aren't explicitly domain admin but have domain admin-like privileges exist out in the entire domain, so we can start targeting it. So these definitely are the good starting points. Auditing and removing a lot of these kind of background lingering issues is one of the best ways to prevent these issues from being exploited.
And can I just ask, is there any indication of date orientation there as well, like in terms of what might be new, what might be old as well? Can you kind of get a sense rather than just a number?
You can get a perspective of, you can add some additional attributes that you want to see, like creation date, as well as password last change dates. All of these things can be inferred with, additions to this command. You saw in the password command we were checking for before, where we were trying to find out, the password last change date. So we could go and look and try and find the administrator with the oldest password. Now, there's some attack tools, which we were talking about before, which, ALSID and the founders of our company were, inspiration for, like Bloodhound, where you can actually find out where a number of these accounts are logged on, because there's a has session attribute and a lot of other information that can be inferred to find targets to go after. So these are very basic, but you can, go through these commands and add a lot more output that gives you a lot more information. These are just designed to be very basic ones to, start the ball. One of the other ones which we like to see people going after is there's very little need nowadays for some of the older protocols like SMB1 or NTLM-v1. Quite often you can restrict these to specific group policies of legacy workstations. You don't necessarily need to have these features enabled on the entire fleet. Quite often, just by having, targeted group policies as well, you can be a little bit more controlled in terms of what you're applying. Instead of having, one policy for users, one policy for servers, you delegate those to having multiple policies for the different roles, and you can do your hardening a lot better there as well. And one of the big things is, simulate attacks, and I'll pass over to Kevin to explain that one.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So this kind of links back to what we were talking about the Kerberos attack previously. So, in another kind of attempt to visualize this, we're just talking about undertaking that attack as part of a red team, or even as a bit more of an objective-oriented penetration test. If you run an attack like this to actually go see, can an attacker get access to a workstation and then use that to get the Kerberos tickets and then crack the tickets, you'll be able to quickly find out whether you can actually detect that attack from happening. Because there's quite a lot of aspects related to it. And that last point there about monitoring for excessive occurrences, you don't see that many requests for SPN tickets on the domain typically. So if you start seeing a large kind of increase over your baseline, if you're already monitoring for that event ID, that's usually a pretty good telltale sign of that Kerberosting attack happening in your network. But as you carry this out as well, you have the added benefit of trying to run those commands that Ben was alluding to earlier, or doing an attacker-oriented version of that to find where the possible accounts on the network that have SPNs that could be exploited are. And then when you go through this exercise, if we can crack the Kerberos ticket and get the password, then that one needs to be changed. Otherwise, it'll just give you awareness of these are the other ones out there that you need to change every so often, making sure it's a 25-character to 30-character password, and then you change it fairly regularly. And then one last example to work off is using these type of Active Directory-based attacks. There is also simulating doing a domain replication, because there's a lot of those configs that Ben was alluding to, where if you're an attacker, you've gained any sort of privilege on the network, you could pretend that you're another domain controller and then have the entire contents of the Active Directory database be replicated to you. If you can pull that off, then you've basically got a copy of all the password hashes and all the different policy configurations in the network that you can understand how this company thinks. If you crack all the passwords, you can demonstrate logging into the CFO or CEO's email and then sending that flag email that's been sent, or logging into the accounts payable guys and saying pay this invoice. Like, you can then go and carry out that type of attack. There's obviously a lot more that can go with it, but these are some of the kind of key Active Directory specific ones. With all those different policy issues and GPO misconfigurations and such that Ben was alluding to, often you can kind of chain those things together to find different problems. Bloodhound that Ben mentioned was a very good tool that we use in our red teams and pen testing, and also attackers use it for as well, to map out the route to active domain admin. So there's actually a pretty cool feature where you can literally click, show me the quickest path to domain admin, and it'll map out from this user account or from whatever account you plug in, how many different hops, which computer do you need to log on to and do that memory dump that Ben showed, so you can get the credential of a more privileged account and then repeat that process, maybe 2 or 3 more times to get domain admin rights. These days is a bit more advanced. It can show you a lot more about the hidden properties, like the SD prop and all those things that Ben mentioned as well, as to, these are the type of privileges that aren't visible necessarily that you need to fix in order to mitigate these issues. But on the flip side, being able to map out the attack pathway from getting to domain admin actually helps you figure out where to fix it. Because if these are the points in which you've got a lot of admins logging onto that machine, and then you probably need to fix that jump host, or you need to change the permissions, stop it from caching passwords in memory, patch that machine, or even look at ways you can segregate that so that doesn't become a single point of failure for privilege escalation and lateral movement. So Bloodhound can also help you as a blue team of defenders to understand how vulnerable your network is as well. So you can think about applying it in that sense.
No worries. Thank you so much for that, Kevin. So that's where we're going to sort of wrap it up for the moment. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask it in the, I think it's in the chat, is it, Chris?
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, there's still the audience is still there. I did have one more poll, but welcome you to ask your questions or just raise your hand if you've got a question. We'll give you some time. Otherwise, let's run one more poll just to get a sense of the teams that they might have in terms of their size. We'll just run this one in terms of the size of the teams. So there's a couple of AD experts there, which is good to know. Any particular questions from the audience? I've got one in terms of once they've got those credentials and they're in, time becomes irrelevant. They can just sit there for a while, can't they? And if they can sort of compromise one or two sets of credentials, then again, it gives them a bit of a backup. I imagine that's what they would do, and then just sit and watch for a while, just in terms of the sort of the motivation behind that.
Yeah, so there's multiple, you know, attackers, especially if they're going after an organization that, if we look at the value of a lot of the ransoms, especially for a big organization, we're talking in the millions of dollars that they're asking. They will quite happily be patient when they're going after those organizations, and you know, they might sit there waiting for the vulnerability they need for a long time, or even some of them are, you know, paying for, you know, access to information in terms of you know, unreleased attacks or so-called 0 days that they may need to take advantage of. But time is irrelevant because an attacker does not necessarily need to cripple the entire organization. But again, they'll quite often put in a lot of backdoors in terms of, you know, I'll create an anonymous user so that I can come back in if I need to, or they might use one of the vulnerabilities that we're looking for, things like adding an account to the you know, admin SD holder, or even another vulnerability called SID history, where, you know, those can be treated as administrators but not show up, particularly when you're running commands like these ones, or looking at reports. Most things aren't going looking for those particular attributes.
We did have one question. Can we get some recommendations for additional tools? And I think you just mentioned one there, beyond Bloodhound and other inspection tools worth using. What are some of those good inspection tools?
ALSID, definitely. So
no bias, but all good.
No bias there, but we, you know, as a tool, we do a very similar inspection of the Active Directory to Bloodhound, but we go well beyond that, because A, we're doing it in real time, and the other thing is we're actually presenting that information in an easy to digest format so that you can actually work through an remediation. It's no good just knowing the issues exist. It's about having the ability to actually go through and start resolving them and have the information you need to resolve them as well. There is quite a lot of open source projects as well that deal in Active Directory security, or, you know, even some of the attack tools like Rubius that Kevin was mentioning before for looking for privileged accounts with SPNs, and there's a really good AD security repository called Payload All the Things, which is good to go look at because it will give you an idea of what tools attackers are using and what attacks are they going after. You know, in addition to using a tool like ALSID, ALSID is designed to be the approach for a corporate, but if you're looking at it from a perspective of research and information, having that knowledge is very handy because it may change your behavior when you're, you know, installing and authoring systems, because you'll think and go, is that going to be something an attacker is going to go looking for?
Very good. Well, look, there's no more questions. I'm just conscious of the time. We're pretty much going to finish up right on time. So if there's no more questions there, I don't think there is. What I'll do is I'll take back control just to finish up. Just 1 second.
Just whilst you do that, another resource that might be useful is adsecurity.org from Sean Metcalf. That's probably one of the Active Directory security Bibles that exist out there. So it's got attack and defense advice that you can look into as well. So take a look at that one if you haven't.
Great, and that was very much appreciated. Good feedback there. So look, on that note, I wish you all a Merry Christmas. Thank you so much to Ben Mudie, Pre-Sales Manager with ALSID, and Kevin Tran, the Director for Asia Pacific and Japan at Spiderlabs, a Trustwave, a Singtel company. And Ben, thank you so much for that. Did appreciate it. There's always some tricks there with when you're doing some demo attacks like that. So I appreciate how you walk through. So look, thank you so much for joining us on MySecurity TV. That was our Active Directory security session with ALSID and Trustwave. Do have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2021. Thank you very much, gents. Do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Sign out. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.